1943 opened with a bold move by the US Navy submarine arm. 3 submarines, Permit, Plunger and Lapon, were ordered to traverse the Lapérouse Strait and enter the Sea of Japan, the body of water that's bounded by Japan on its eastern side and the main Asian continent on its western side. It seemed a logical, if somewhat risky, tactic, with there being only 3 real entrances to the Sea of Japan, all of which are narrow, and at the time 2 of which were entirely bracketed by Japanese or Japanese-held territory. It was about as close to landlocked as you could get, whilst still being usefully connected to the ocean, and so it should, in theory, be full of Japanese shipping with relatively minimal escort, busily shuttling resources along the Japanese coast, or between occupied Korea and Japan, which should make for some relatively easy targets. The Lapérouse Strait itself wasn't going to be the easiest thing to clear, as it's under 30 miles wide and it was still held by Japan on one side, that being actual Japanese territory, with Soviet territory on the opposite side. Since it seemed fairly obvious that the entry point that the submarines had taken would become glaringly obvious to the Japanese once various ships in the Sea of Japan started to explode, and therefore, logically, Japanese anti-submarine assets would move to close the strait, the big old submarine Narwhal, armed with a pair of 6-inch guns, was also assigned to bombard a newly discovered airfield on one of the northern Kuril Islands. This bombardment was timed to coincide with the planned withdrawal date for the submarines from the Sea of Japan. It was hoped that this nearby but not quite too nearby bombardment would draw the attention of the nearby anti-submarine vessels and thus facilitate the trio's intrepid escape. Unfortunately, the expedition ran into multiple problems. Whilst the northern area of the Sea of Japan wasn't plagued by solid sheet ice and icebergs, as it often could be in colder months, there was still a fair amount of slushy sea ice and a regular, heavy and long-lasting fog, which made it rather difficult to see anything a lot of the time, let alone distant freighters. Permit and Plunger were also old subs. Lapon was brand new, but as it turned out, her SJ surface search radar, which might have allowed her to stalk unseen on the surface, flat out refused to work. Permit's crew were then hit by a wave of inexplicable nausea and vomiting, which lasted several days and left them unable to work the boat in any aggressive manner for that time. And they then had even worse luck once they had recovered and found something to shoot at. 2 ships were spotted, a wave of Mark 14s was sent out, and as usual, a bunch of them failed to work. Eventually, after considerable expenditure, one of the ships was sunk and the other one was damaged. Permit decided to surface and finish off the second ship with the more reliable deck gun, only for a rogue wave to sneak up behind her and almost flood the ship. This short-circuited Permit's own radar, and would leave her reliant on groping around in the fog after some heroic efforts to get the sea back where it belonged, outside the submarine, turned out to be successful. 4 other targets would be tracked, but none of them were hit. Then a trawler was spotted and shelled, only it turned out to be a Soviet trawler, and at the time the USSR was neutral to Japan but allied to the USA, and that meant that the submarine had to make its way along with a dozen bewildered Russian trawler crew aboard. Luckily, they treated the survivors well enough that upon his return to the USSR, the Russian captain reported that an unknown submarine had shelled his ship, and then Permit had just happened to show up and pick up the survivors. Plunger was the most aggressive of the 3, but in 6 attacks on various convoys, they managed to expend most of their torpedoes in exchange for just 1 kill. The thump of duds and the distant boom of premature Mark 14s being a far too common and familiar refrain. Plunger then achieved as good results simply by sailing up to some other ships that it had spotted and opening up with its 3-inch deck gun. Part of the expedition's woes came from the fact that, frankly, there just weren't that many ships present. A large portion of Japanese merchant shipping was engaged in either supplying the front lines out in the Pacific Ocean proper, or in shipping resources back from more distant conquests such as the Dutch East Indies, and most Japanese coastal traffic was on the eastern Pacific side of Japan, thanks in part to the presence of most of the major cities on that side, and partly because Japan's mountainous terrain makes shipping goods the 70 to 100 miles that would be required for them to go across Japan from western ports considerably more difficult in the 1940s than that distance alone would seem to imply. The sub's return journey went without too much incident, Japanese anti-submarine efforts apparently either having not noticed the loss of a handful of ships, or just not caring all that much, as in the end Narwhal's planned diversion had no effect, as she arrived late, was then made even later in actually bombarding the target by fog, and was then driven off of her bombardment in fairly short order by accurate counterfire from Japanese shore batteries, with the entire episode occurring after the other three subs had actually successfully extracted themselves anyway. Further south, somewhat better luck was being had, with a number of new submarines landing commandos, supplies, guns and ammunition for resistance fighters in the Philippines, but reports of the Mark 14 continuing to give trouble kept stacking up, even with the magnetic detonator disabled. USS Salmon was happy to report that one of her torpedoes had hit a smaller freighter and had failed to explode, but at the very least the impact had been violent enough to punch a large hole in the ship, and that had sunk the target anyway. But more generally, even multiple direct hits that did result in some sort of explosion seemed to be doing relatively little. This seemed odd, because if they were using Torpex warheads, theoretically the Mark 14 had an equivalent to almost 1,000 pounds of TNT in the nose. Yet, whilst Japanese Navy torpedoes seemed to have very little issue snapping US destroyers in two or blowing the bows off of so many US cruisers, US submarine captains were reporting that larger freighters were eating 2 or 3 hits and then sailing off into the sunset, despite merchant shipping generally being built significantly less well than military shipping. And that was when the torpedoes exploded at all. This can best be exemplified by 2 patrols that took place over late July and early August 1943, those of the Tinosa and Wahoo. Tinosa, under the captain of Dan Daspit, had come across a 19,000-ton whaling factory ship, one of the largest merchant ships in Japanese service, and had launched a 4-torpedo spread at an almost perfect perpendicular angle. 2 torpedoes hit, with a pair of clangs that indicated failure to detonate. The big target noticed it was under attack and made to escape, but Tinosa had kept her last 2 remaining forward tubes ready for this eventuality, launched the 2 torpedoes, and scored another 2 hits on the aft of the ship as it turned away. If those had been long lance hits from, or in this case the submarine-launched Type 95 derivative of the long lance, the stern of that ship should have vanished in a cloud of metal confetti. Instead, the apparent force of 2,000 pounds of TNT equivalent simply made the merchant ship coast to a halt. Daspit now had a conundrum. He could see through his periscope, since it was daylight, that the Tonan Maru, his target, had a number of deck guns, and was now, rather understandably, on the alert. So surfacing to try and finish off the big ship with his own deck gun was pretty much out of the question. On the other hand, it had cost him 25% of his entire payload just to bring the thing to a halt, and he didn't especially want to waste any more torpedoes. He concluded that, since the target was stopped in the water, he would conduct the submarine version of an execution shot to the back of the head, and settled in less than 1,000 yards away from the completely stationary vessel, directly abeam, and fired a single torpedo which was aimed square amidships. The torpedo ran true, hit square on the target, and failed to detonate. He then methodically moved from one textbook attack position to another and sent torpedo after torpedo downrange. 8 more single shots resulted in 8 more clangs, and a very bemused crew on the Tonan Maru. With a single torpedo left in his forward torpedo room, every single other weapon there having been expended on this one target, which it should be noted was salvaged and brought back into service, at least until US carrier aircraft finished off later in the war, Daspit ordered the submarine to turn around and head for Pearl Harbor in a fury that hadn't abated by the time the submarine arrived. Admiral Lockwood took one look at the apoplectic lieutenant commander standing in his office and recorded that he was expecting a volley of invective cursing everyone from Lockwood to the Bureau of Ordnance to the Newport Torpedo Station, the Pearl Harbor Torpedo Shop, and all of their ancestors back to the 5th generation, and was quite prepared to let him do so despite the technical insubordination that would have been a lieutenant commander screaming in the face of an admiral. But the poor man appeared to be so angry that he could barely even speak, let alone deliver his report. This was further not helped when the very last torpedo in Tenosa's forward compartment had its detonator removed and tested statically ashore, only for it to work flawlessly. Given the circumstances, it's a minor miracle that Dan Daspit would end up making flag rank and actually end up as in command of the Atlantic Fleet submarines during the Cold War, eventually reaching the age of 73, instead of combusting on the spot right there in August 1943. Meanwhile, with its revised crew, Wahoo had been headed out for the Sea of Japan, along with Plunger, which was back for a second try. They were going to try their luck in this area again in the hope of potentially finding more targets. Resolving to fire single shots, Captain Morton proceeded to make 9 attacks on different targets. 8 single shots, and then one that used 2 torpedoes on an especially large target. All attacks were launched at well under 1,000 yards, and all were greeted by the thud of a dud, at most with perhaps some of the unexpended air flasks exploding, or else lovely pure silence, with the sole exception of one torpedo that ran shallow, leapt out of the ocean, and then detonated full force only 23 seconds after leaving the tube when it hit a wave on its way back in. As it turned out, in the eventuality of things, like USS Salmon, 2 of Wahoo's targets were actually badly damaged simply from being rammed by the several tons of inert torpedo that was speeding along at 45 knots, but at the time Morton obviously wasn't to know that. With a single full salvo of 6 left in his forward tubes, Morton requested early termination of the patrol and, in receiving acknowledgement, headed home. Plunger, meanwhile, had similar luck. She expended 15 torpedoes for a grand total of 3 actual detonations. Wahoo then managed to sink 3 small ships on its way back, but for this, Morton used his deck gun. What exactly was going on? Admiral Lockwood wanted to know just as much as anyone else, and with the newest idea coming down the line, the Mark 18 electric torpedo, which was a Bureau of Ordnance improved version of the German G7E, there was going to be a lot of testing in his future. Having managed to calm poor old Dan Daspit down sufficiently that he wouldn't maul a random torpedo technician in the manner of a particularly aggressive Wolverine, Lockwood took a suggestion from Captain Momsen, who was a rather inventive fellow. In his spare time, he'd invented the submarine escape device, which was named after him, the Momsen Lung, and Momsen's idea was to take a bunch of Mark 14s that were currently in storage at Pearl Harbor, on a submarine that was currently present in Pearl Harbor, and head over to the small island of Kahulawe, whose coastline included a number of large sheer cliffs that then plunged down about 50 feet below sea level to the ocean floor. There, he proposed, they would fire these torpedoes at the cliffs until one of them failed to detonate, then go down and recover it, pull up the warhead, and examine it. Lockwood recorded that he was privately mildly concerned about their long-term survival prospects if they went poking around a smashed-up torpedo loaded with just under 700 pounds of very live Torpex, in which was a detonator of questionable status, which they would now commence poking, but he agreed anyway. The USS Muskellunge was the chosen vessel, and along with the USS Widgeon, which would serve as the base vessel for the recovery of any failed-to-detonate torpedoes, they headed out. The first 2 torpedoes worked, but the third one failed. It was then recovered, and found to have 2 major flaws. The firing pin guide rails had bent under the force of the impact, but in addition, the firing pin, whilst still in this case having managed to make its way to the detonator caps, had not retained sufficient force to actually initiate them upon striking. Thus informed, a program was enacted of taking torpedo warheads that were filled with inert materials in place of the explosives, and then using a cherry picker, they were suspended 90 feet above a steel plate, which was positioned at the base of a dry dock, whereupon the warhead would be dropped and the resulting mess analysed. Back over in Maryland, Lockwood's program of experiments also prompted a series of live run tests with dummy warheads aimed at a floating target. All of this led to a series of depressing discoveries over the summer, as the following letters and reports illustrate. At the end of August, Admiral Lockwood wrote the following letter to Admiral Spike Blandy, who was in charge of the Bureau of Ordnance, which contains in part the following. I note in your letter that you will do some shooting against submerged armour plate, and I hope you will push this matter along, since the question as to whether this Mark VI exploder will be fatally deformed by head-on collision is a very vital one to me. The reports of the Tenosa and Wahoo as to duds and deep running are practically unbelievable to me. On the other hand, it is unbelievable that experienced submarine officers can shoot torpedoes at the simplest sort of elementary approaches within ranges near 1,000 yards at slow-moving targets and still miss. Since these reports, Salmon, who was operating off Sakhalin, reports hitting a ship with a dud, but so effectively that it evidently punched a hole and the crew immediately started abandoning ship. He later hit her again and blew her bow off, but it would be interesting to know whether or not the dud hit would have sunk her. Plunger is on her way in now after a trip into the Japan Sea, where the ships are apparently as thick as rabbits in Australia, though of small size. He has also reported by dispatch duds and deep running. Recent events have drawn attention to the Mark III exploder, now used by the S-boats with the Mark X torpedo. It certainly looks very rugged and dependable. Would it be possible to modify it so as to use it in the chamber designed for the Mark VI? The results obtained from your firings against armour and my firings against cliffs may give us an answer to the desirability of this change. There are occasional reports of low-order explosions, and I've heard rumours from the Gun Club boys that such a thing is not unknown in Torpex, and that this is the reason for the proposed change in the location of the exploder chamber in Torpex heads. Is there any truth to these rumours? About a week later, over at the US Naval Mine Warfare Test Station in Maryland, the following report was submitted. Summary of effectiveness of exploder mechanisms: 8 Mark VI Mod 1A and 2 Mark V Mod 1s. 19 Mark 14 Mod 3A torpedoes have been fired to date. 10 hit the target and 9 missed. One was an erratic run probably caused by dented warhead. Of the 10 hits, 2 exploder mechanisms have not been recovered. 4 firing pins stabbed the detonator with insufficient force to actuate it. 1 firing pin did not strike the detonator cap due to distortion of the mechanism, and 3 fired, 1 in a specially strengthened head with a voided nose. The specially strengthened head showed the least damage of all heads used. The other heads were so badly damaged with the detonators knocked completely out of the head that there is some doubt as to whether they would have set off high-order detonations even if they had operated properly. Of the 9 misses that hit the beach, 1 fired normally, 1 hit pilings, 2 glancing blows port and starboard and fired, 1 ran erratic and fired, and 6 failed to fire, recovered fully armed and in cocked position. Of the entire 19 shots fired, only 2 fired in the normal manner, 4 fired due to special circumstances or alteration, 2 weren't recovered, and 11 failed to fire. 4 out of the 5 direct hits that failed to fire actually stabbed the detonator, but with insufficient impact. It is submitted that a simple step toward the elimination of failures is the use of stronger firing springs. The next day, a follow-up letter was sent subject to the previous report, which reads, based on inspection of material recovered from torpedo tests, it is suggested that the simplest way of immediately making present service torpedoes more effective may be to provide a buffer nose attached to the warhead. The object of this nose will be to decelerate the torpedo sufficiently to operate the firing mechanism prior to the breaking up of the warhead. It may be necessary to make the following changes to the Mark VI Mod 1A exploder mechanism in order to shorten the time interval from first impact to firing. A. Increase the strength of the firing spring. B. Provide a thicker firing plate so that less displacement of the firing ring is required to actuate the mechanism. And C. Install a bracket for lifting the idler gear similar to the model submitted to the Bureau. This eliminates any strain on the guide pins subsequent to the arming and damage to the guide pins upon distortion of the head. both of which tend to slow and possibly check the movement of the firing pin. Based on test damage to the guide pins, it is suggested that the following modifications to the Mark VI Mod 1A exploder mechanisms be effected. A. Provide a shoulder 1/8 inch high and 3/8 inch in diameter to the lower end of the guide pins. B. Leave an overall threaded stud length of 3/8 of an inch below the shoulder, undercut thread for a length not over 1/16 of an inch adjacent to the shoulder. C. Secure pin in place and file a flat on the inner portion of the shoulder to clear up the arming screw. D. Cut back grooves on the firing pin guide 0.02 of an inch. E. Require the use of go and no-go gauges to check clearance between firing pin guide and guide pins, with the firing pin in cocked position at half travel and full travel. No head supplied to date has been adequately strengthened. It appears that minimum satisfactory strengthening of the head must guarantee that the section of the head where the firing mechanism is secured will not be distorted. This will require both circumferential and longitudinal members in that portion of the head. As issues began to pile up, it became clear that things were so urgent that multiple documents at this stage in the archives have the following paragraph appended to them. The urgency of delivery of this document is such that it will not reach the addressee in time by the next available officer courier. The originator therefore authorises the transmission of this document by registered mail within the continental limits of the United States, which, considering these things were stamped all over with secret and top secret, was a heck of a risk to take, which gives you some idea of how seriously the problem was now finally being treated. By the end of September, Lockwood sent the following letter back to Spike Blandy at the Bureau of Ordnance. Dear Spike, your letter of the 15th of September was received with much pleasure. I am delighted to see that you are really doing some experiments and that you confirm our own investigations. I have been loath to use the cavity in the nose arrangement because of the necessity for repouring all our heads, for which the mine depot here is not well equipped. However, I do believe that such a procedure in the future heads for the Mark 14 torpedoes would be very helpful, since it is evident from the destruction of the heads which we have observed in our own full-scale drop tests that any cushioning of the impact which we can obtain will be all to the good. 2 of the drop tests we made yesterday opened up the base plate and shot the generator out into the dry dock, while one of them shot the entire base plate out. The wreckage of the interior of the exploder cavity and the deformation of the wall to the cavity itself is terrific. Often we had to use a chisel and hammer the walls back into position in order to extract the firing mechanism. You will recall from my 190704 and my confidential serial 01325 dated 22nd of September, we stated that to date the electric exploder offered the best prospects of success. However, when we used the complete torpedo, the microswitch shattered all to pieces, and since that time, even though the switch has been strengthened and protected, we have achieved only duds with that mechanism. The dark horse has been the light aluminium firing pin with heavier spring and the chamfering of all sharp corners. The E&R shop, led by Tom Eddy, has been working night and day on this project, and every time one of their brainchildren failed, they would go into effecting improvements. Finally, their brainchild has come across and made good. For yesterday, we completed 5 full-scale drop tests onto the bottom of Mr. Furlong's best dry dock, and every one of them was a success. Naturally, we are on the crest of the wave, as you will note from my 270054. I talked the matter over last night with Admiral Nimitz, who has been following our experiments very closely, and with Admiral King, and both agreed we should get these into production immediately. Tomorrow, the Pollock will take 5 of these exploders with live warheads and fire them at Kahulawe, all on 90-degree tracks. I'm convinced there is no need of firing oblique tracks, since we know that they will fire on oblique tracks and on the turn at the bilge. Otherwise, we would not be getting the astounding bags which my boys are turning in at the moment. The only thing which might limit our production program is the supply of aluminium. These firing pins were made from an old airplane prop, and we should be able to find plenty of those over on Ford Island. If the final firing tests are successful, or even moderately so, please put your shops to work in effecting the modifications just as we have made them here, and try to keep them from making any so-called improvements. We know this rig will work, and for a temporary expedient, awaiting your new design, we don't need any improvements. The whole business is very simple, and we can turn them out here in quantities limited only by the stock of material necessary. I will send a man to Midway to give them a hand in effecting changes as soon as possible. Until we get these changes effective and until we receive your new design, we will try to always shoot oblique tracks set for the turn of the bilge. There is just one more experiment we want to make, and that is net shots at about 500 yards. Recently, a submarine reported 3 misses, some of them probably underneath, at about 600 yards. I want to know whether the Mark 14 returns to its set depth at about 500 to 600 yards. We had a very pleasant and instructive visit from Ruddock last week, and I went over the whole situation with him. He told us all your plans for a new magnetic exploder and also for a new contact exploder. We would welcome both, as the only sure way to get these small light draft escort vessels is with a magnetic shot. These small vessels are becoming a pestilence and are more efficient and dangerous than destroyers. We would welcome some kind of an acoustic torpedo at the earliest possible date, for, as you know, they are very small targets and will require something to actually chase them down. I know you fully appreciate the urgency of our need and your new design contact exploder. Last month, August, our torpedo performance was as follows: 177 torpedoes fired, of which 64 hit, of which 18 were duds. But now I feel sure we have this difficulty by the tail and only need room in which to swing it. I am keeping boats at sea informed daily of our results, and to date they are using their heads splendidly to achieve outstanding success. For instance, when the permit needed to fire a shallow draft 90-degree shot to administer the coup de grace to a big tanker, she set it for low speed and sent her to the bottom with a 6th hit on her, 5 other full-scale explosions having failed to do the job. With best regards to you and Dr. Einstein and all the other long-haired boys, sincerely, C.A. Lockwood Jr. So, in case you weren't able to keep up with all that correspondence, the list of problems that the Mark 14 and its Mark 6 exploder had was roughly summarised as the following. The head of the torpedo was too weak and crushed too quickly. Since it was also full of solid explosive, as it crushed, this force was very rapidly transmitted back to the detonator, and the detonator could be crushed and mangled out of all the recognition and made unable to fire by a severe impact, like, say, a direct perpendicular strike. This could also have a secondary effect of not just damaging or destroying the detonator, but also catapulting the detonator clean out of the torpedo, where even if it did function, it of course wouldn't actually cause the warhead to explode, and if it detonated part way out, there was a good chance it would only cause a low-order explosion in the warhead, which will go a long way to explaining why multiple hits on various targets seem to be relatively ineffective, as you would see a big explosion, but being a low-order explosion, it wouldn't be anywhere near as damaging to the target. While there was nothing that could be done for existing torpedoes, there were various changes that could be made to help with this, partly, as was mentioned in one of the letters and reports, to strengthen the structure of the tip of the torpedo itself, and partly by also pouring the explosive in such a way as to leave a gap at the nose of the torpedo, which would then crush down, hopefully also being strengthened, somewhat slower, which would give the detonator more time to fire, but also, as it was crushing an air gap, it wouldn't immediately transmit the shock of the crushing to the detonator via the main explosive charge. And then, assuming the detonator actually stayed inside the torpedo long enough to try and do its job, the guide pins were bending, which could potentially prevent the firing pin from reaching the detonator cap at all, and even if it didn't, it would slow the firing pin down quite considerably, which would result in the impact against the detonator caps not being enough to set them off. The solution to this was, of course, to make thicker and stronger guide rails, and then the firing pin in question was also actually a little bit too light, which meant that even if it managed to reach the detonator caps without having encountered bent guide rails, it often didn't have the force, even when fully functional, to detonate the detonator caps. The solution to this was obviously to make a bigger, heavier firing pin, but of course more mass being propelled by the same firing spring would result in a slower impact, and the speed of the detonator working was one of the major problems, because they needed the detonator to work before the crushing of the warhead reached the detonator, and then obviously would crush the detonator as well. And so you also needed to make stronger springs so that the heavier firing pin would be propelled quicker and with more force into the detonator caps, which would also mean that even if the specially strengthened guide rails bent, they would still force its way past the guide rails in the first place, and with enough energy to set off the detonator caps, and hopefully all of this would happen before the end of the torpedo warhead had been crushed to a point that it popped the Mark 6 exploder out of the torpedo anyway. And the whole thing needed plenty of lubrication, because a further technical report noted that with the 600 to 800 typical G load of the detonator being slammed forward as the torpedo hit the side of a ship, and in some cases the accelerometers registered well over 1400 G, any kind of friction that was incurring between the firing pin and the guide rails could just friction lock the thing into place, because very usefully the firing pin was perpendicular to the angle of travel. And so the only way to deal with that was to ensure the whole thing was very well lubricated with oil, because the oil film would ensure correct lubrication, at least for the fractions of a second that it was needed to allow the firing pin to travel to the detonator caps. So in short, almost every aspect of the nose of the Mark 14 torpedo and the Mark 6 exploder had to be either redesigned or rebuilt. Now, as you will have picked up from Admiral Lockwood's letters, during August and September, they were experiencing a somewhat higher success rate than in July and early August, as we've recounted earlier. And that was essentially because one of the earliest things to come out of the tests was that obviously the greatest amount of force encountered was if you had a perpendicular hit, which was what you would try for if you were following the pre-war doctrine. But if you got a glancing blow, then obviously it would take slightly longer for the crushing to occur, and the overall impact was slightly less because you had to resolve the impact forces in two planes rather than just the one, and therefore the detonator stood a greater chance of surviving long enough to work, and with slightly less force being exerted on it, it was less likely to bend or break. And so orders had gone out right from the beginning of the testing to try and fire your torpedoes in such a way that they hit at a glancing angle, ideally about 45 degrees, and this had significantly upped the success rate of US submarines in mid to late August and then into September, although, again, as Admiral Lockwood's letter notes, there was still a fair number of duds caused by the aforementioned issues, which all needed to be fixed. There were, of course, other dangers besides poorly functioning torpedoes. USS Pollock had a fun experience when, having worked its way into a convoy in late August and set up a deflection shot to successfully sink a small freighter, she was then attacked by 3 escorting ships. With flank speed set, the submarine dived, but the bow planes then refused to level out, and with the bow pointing further and further down, the sub plunged towards the ocean floor, completely out of control. With the crew standing on the bulkheads or hanging on to whatever solid object they could find, her captain ordered all ballast tanks blown. But this actually made the problem worse, as all the air rushed upwards within the ballast tanks, collecting in the stern and leaving the bow tanks flooded. At this point, if you'd stuck a water-driven siren on the outside, Pollock was doing a creditable impression of an underwater Stuka, and anything left that was loose in the submarine was cascading past the crew in a clash of metal and glass, heading down towards the torpedo room in the bow. The captain managed to reach a communication station in time to accept an engineer's suggestion to put the sub's motors into full reverse, and gradually the sub began to slow, pausing suspended and almost vertical at 450 feet in depth according to the control room depth gauge, which was 200 feet past the test depth of the submarine, and it also meant that the torpedo room was at about 600 foot depth, which was practically synonymous with the crush depth of that particular class of sub. Slowly, without the pressure of the bow planes, thanks to the lack of forward momentum, the submarine began to level out, but then, with the ballast tanks blown empty, she began to rise again, very rapidly. This would be almost as bad, as the enemy anti-submarine warfare ships were right overhead, mostly trying to make sense of the absolute cacophony of noise and air that was coming up from below them, since they hadn't actually done anything depth charge-wise just yet. Now, Pollock was desperately flooding her ballast tanks, which caused a further upwelling of air. Luckily, she slowed to a hover just before broaching, and as it turned out, when the periscope was raised, it ran straight into the keel of the Japanese destroyer that was leading the search for the Pollock, which happened to be sitting a few feet above them. With the escort still desperately trying to work out what on earth was going on below the waves, Pollock snuck away. During the July to September period, 4 submarines had been lost. Runner, Grayling, and Pompano were lost to unknown causes, although a mine, ramming by a Japanese transport, and enemy anti-submarine warfare ships are the prime suspects in those cases, respectively. And lastly, towards the end of September, the USS Cisco was caught by air and surface-based anti-submarine warfare forces and sunk with all hands. Their loss didn't come entirely in vain, however. During August and September, the US submarine forces, thanks to the interim torpedo aiming tactics, reported sinking 4 warships and 50 merchant vessels totaling just under 220,000 tons. By the end of September, the first batch of modified Mark VI exploders had arrived, and USS Barb left port on the 30th with 20 Mark XIVs equipped with the new devices installed. Of course, occasionally the Mark XIV's habit of misbehaving terribly did have unforeseen benefits, as one Jim Allen aboard USS Sperry would recall. He wrote, "It's tough to remember exact dates from 50 years ago, but I believe it was mid-1943, and I was in Submarine Division 102 aboard the subtender USS Sperry. We were tied at the long dock of the sub-base in Pearl Harbor. With no duties at the time, I wandered to the bridge where there was a great view of the base and Navy Yard. There were a few boats tied up at the finger piers off to the port side. One was firing water slugs from the stern tubes. For the uninitiated, this involves going through all the steps to fire a torpedo, except there's no torpedo involved. At least there's not supposed to be a torpedo in the tube. The tube is filled with water, and the procedure allows a full check of the firing circuits. Every time I would hear a whoomp of the water slugs, I would glance in that direction and note the disturbance of water boiling up at the stern. When the 3rd or 4th slug was fired, I was flabbergasted to see a torpedo wake streaking out across the harbour in the direction of the Navy Yard. The bridge of the Sperry must have been 100 feet above the waterline, so I had a panoramic view. The wake was headed straight at the stern of a freighter docked broadside to the speeding torpedo. I believe I was the only eyewitness. However, I was sure the crew members who had fired the slug knew something was different. I remember thinking that maybe there was ammunition aboard that freighter, but I couldn't move. I couldn't take my eyes off the wake. The procedure for firing water slugs called for a maximum depth setting, so when the torpedo was about 200 foot short of the freighter, it must have hit the bottom. There was a gigantic explosion, a geyser of mud and water shot into the air, and the stern of the freighter seemed to lift 20 feet before it slammed back down. A shockwave travelled through the water and through the air and jarred the Sperry when it hit. Water and mud came raining down out of the sky, and a big circular wave was rushing away from the point of detonation. A period of calm followed, but it was probably only a few seconds. I heard running footsteps and became aware that signal lights were flashing all over the place whilst the Sperry bugler was blowing general quarters. Moments later, general quarters was sounded for the whole base and Navy Yard. The bridge of the Sperry quickly filled with more brass than I'd ever seen in one place, and general quarters was gonging away. Men in battle helmets and life preservers were rushing up and down ladders and along the deck. Ammunition was broken out for the 20 and 40mm anti-aircraft guns, and the 5-inch gun turrets came alive. Over the loudspeaker, "Single up all lines, prepare to get underway." I heard the captain order the signalman to ask the water tower at the Navy Yard, the centre of communication, "Are we under attack?" Gathering courage, I stepped forward with a snappy salute and said, "Sir, I can explain." That's as far as I got when one of the officers growled, "Do you have a battle station? Then get to it." Stammering, I said, But, sir..." That's all I got out. I was ordered to my battle station, or the Master at Arms would have me on report. My battle station was in the magazine of the aft 5-inch gun, loading shells into a vertical hoist. Eventually, the guys who fired the torpedo came forward and admitted their goof. In another few minutes, we were secured from general quarters, and things just went back to normal. I never did come forward as probably the only eyewitness of the great 1943 Pearl Harbor attack. However, just as the US submarines were on their home stretch when it came to Mark XIV issues, the brand new Mark 18 arrived. Suffice to say, we'll cover that torpedo in its own video alongside this series, but its list of issues included, but were not limited to, batteries that gave off large amounts of hydrogen gas constantly, which could result in fuel-air explosions either in the torpedo tube, or in the submarine, This Admiral Lockwood and his staff temporarily solved by connecting a bit of nichrome wire to the battery array in a manner akin to an unshielded light bulb filament. This didn't actually stop the hydrogen production, but it did burn it off consistently in small quantities. The Mark 18 also needed to be recharged every few days. The battery compartment was too weak and tended to deform on launch, which would send the torpedoes off course, and the battery compartment was also poorly insulated, so the torpedo's range and speed was highly dependent on the temperature of the water that it was launched into. The control surfaces tended to break, resulting in further interesting unplanned permutations of direction and depth. It was also not quite capable of 30 knots, and thus would need to be launched at either very short ranges or with significantly more deflection than the Mark 14, and torpedoes of that slower speed hadn't actually been anticipated by the designers of the Torpedo Data Computer, the TDC, the fire control system for modern US subs, which meant that when you were inputting the variables into the TDC, you had to interpolate quite considerably if you wanted to fire a Mark 18 for quite some time during the Second World War. On September the 8th, 1942, USS Wahoo left on another patrol. Mush Morton's faith in the Mark 14, which at that stage, remember, had not yet been fixed, was so utterly broken he agreed to take on 24 hand-modified Mark 18s instead, along with Bob Logue, one of Admiral Lockwood's best technicians and who had spent much of the summer dealing with the worst of the Mark 18's offences against God, man, sanity and the natural order of things. Wahoo was headed for the Sea of Japan once again, this time in company with USS Sawfish. But this time it would be her last patrol. On September the 21st, Wahoo sank the large fishing boat Hokusei Maru with her deck gun, about 150 miles east of the La Pérouse Strait. After this, working out Wahoo's last movements is done mainly by piecing together what got blown up in the Sea of Japan compared to what Sawfish reported attacking, and the difference being attributable obviously to Wahoo. From these reports, it seems that at some point in the next few days, Morton made it through the strait, for on the 25th, the Taiko Maru was hit by a single torpedo amidships and sunk in the Sea of Japan. Then on the 29th, the Masaki Maru was sunk off the Korean coast. Sawfish had no luck. Its Mark 18s either ran too slowly in the cold water, or bashed into the tubes and the bow on launch, causing them to veer wildly off course thanks to the damage to their guidance fins. 3 of her torpedoes just sank without ever activating, and another one activated but dove immediately for the seabed and then failed to explode. Sawfish's Mark 14s were also defective, the batch assigned clearly being unmodified. One of them leapt out of the sea, and 2 others failed to detonate on impact. But with Logue the technician aboard Wahoo, it seemed that whatever issues plagued the Mark 18 had been solved aboard that sub. The Konron Maru, Kanko Maru, and Hankau Maru went down in quick succession. Unfortunately, Morton's habit of attacking anything that moved was probably also his downfall, as plotting these 3 sinkings on a map, and accounting for time, gave a rather clear line of progress from Korea heading straight for the La Pérouse Straits. On October the 11th, therefore, 2 Japanese float planes and 3 anti-submarine warfare vessels were waiting at the eastern end of the strait, and at 0920, one of the aircraft spotted a small oil slick, the type that was discharged occasionally by the lubricants of a submarine's propeller shafts. In the clear waters lit by the rising sun, it then spotted the dark shadow of a submarine conning tower just below the surface. Diving in, the aircraft dropped a bomb which appears to have detonated underneath the sub, for it was temporarily forced up with the hull breaching the surface. The second bomb that the aircraft carried caused air bubbles and thick oil to rise to the surface. Then the second aircraft showed up, and more bombs were dropped as the shape of Wahoo appeared occasionally in the depths of the crystal-clean waters. The oil patches that resulted made it clear the sub was badly damaged, for it had turned roughly northwest and was making for Soviet waters, which at this point of the war would have meant they would have been interred, but they would also have been safe. The aircraft then raced back to the nearest harbour that had bombs ready for them, rearmed and headed back out again. Bomb after bomb was dropped, and soon air bubbles began to appear ahead of the growing oil slick. Gradually, as the attacks wore on, the submarine seemed to slow, then it began to rise, continuing northwest now at a bare crawl, running shallow enough to produce a wake on the surface, although it hadn't yet breached. The amount of air reported coming up by the pilots makes it likely that multiple compartments at this point had been breached, and the submarine may have been trying to surface to get the crew off. The aircraft by this point were staggering their runs back for more bombs, in order to allow at least one of them to be over the sub at all times, and had called in the patrol ships. Depth charges were now added to the stream of bombs, and finally, at 13:30, 4 hours after the first sighting, Wahoo stopped moving, gave one large major gush of oil, which was probably the last of its fuel being blown out in a desperate attempt to surface, and then slipped out of sight a mere 5 miles from Soviet waters. There would be no survivors. This was, of course, unknown to the US Navy, who sent out search planes along the route back to Midway just in case the non-reporting Wahoo was running damaged and unable to radio in. She would eventually be posted overdue and presumed lost on November 9th, 1943. Her former first officer, O'Kane, would then spend the rest of the year turning his own new command, USS Tang, into a machine fit to avenge his former CO and friends aboard Wahoo. Back in Pearl Harbor, as well as continuing efforts to try and fix the Mark 18, Admiral Lockwood was having to fend off another threat: the Navy Department and its bright ideas. They'd noticed some of the flak U-boats the Kriegsmarine had been deploying that summer, and they proposed to enact similar changes on US subs. Except that instead of covering the submarines with Orlikans and Bofors, they'd come up with other bright ideas, like an 8-ton cone-shaped rocket launcher that was supposed to be mounted aft of the submarine's sail, that was then supposed to fire a large rocket trailing a line of steel wire straight up into the air. The idea being that an aircraft that was passing over the sub on an attack run would either foul its propeller or slice off a wing. The small issue of any aircraft thus caught having already dropped its explosive payload by the time it passed over the sub seemed entirely lost to them, as did requests to explain quite why a rocket launcher and a spool of wire took up 8 tons. Nonetheless, in the face of strong objections to this and other similarly strange ideas, they fell back on the slightly saner idea of covering the subs in waterproof 20mm or 40mm guns, albeit Admiral Lockwood and most of the submarine captains of the day preferred their subs to have a smaller silhouette and just dive to get away from incoming aircraft. Japanese anti-submarine warfare aircraft weren't to be written off, that was for sure, but Japanese air power, even near the home islands, was nothing like that wielded by the Allies over the Atlantic, and the Imperial Japanese Navy's aircraft strength was already declining, never mind the fact that the flak U-boats turned out to be a bit of a dead end anyway. Admiral King chipped in with an idea that everybody actually liked. He suggested a multi-barreled anti-aircraft mount which could be remotely operated via the periscope, thus not requiring anyone to actually be out on deck. But, as it turned out, whilst the idea was implemented, it was a little too complicated to complete and get fully working before the war ended, although some of the fruits of that idea would later be seen in some of the remote-controlled turrets in post-war bombers. More immediately, there was the first delivery of PPI scopes for submarine radar. This is the classic round screen with the various distinct dots that ping up as a beam sweeps around it, which we commonly associate with radar scopes these days, as opposed to the oscilloscope-style spiky lines which had characterized earlier radars. This was a great help in more immediately understanding the output of the search radars being installed on subs, which now came in both surface and air search flavors, and these radar systems were being installed on older submarines and fitted on new ones from the start. But in addition to the Wahoo, the last 3 months of 1943 would see the loss of 5 other subs. S-44 was sunk after sailing in on the surface to attack a radar contact that they'd identified as a small merchant vessel but turned out to be a heavily armed Japanese escort ship. The Dorado was lost on her maiden voyage before seeing action whilst transiting the Caribbean, victim of either a friendly aircraft or a German minefield, depending on who you believe. The Corvina made it to the combat area, but was also sunk on her maiden voyage, this time by the Japanese submarine I-176, which spotted the Corvina on the surface near Truk and torpedoed her. Sculpin was lost in the same area whilst attacking a fast merchant convoy, the Japanese convoy commander managing to predict her attack pattern and leave the destroyer Yamagumo lying in wait. Lastly, for 1943, the Capelin vanished in the Celebes Sea, either a victim of mines or direct enemy action. On a brighter note, October saw the deployment of US Navy subs for the first time in a particular life-saving role. With the invasion of the Gilbert Islands coming up, there was a planned raid on the Marcus Islands to get the flight crews of the many new carriers trained up in a live attack run, and it was asked if submarines might be positioned near the islands to rescue pilots whose aircraft might take damage and be forced to ditch in short order, as this was held preferable to falling into enemy hands for a very long list of reasons. USS Snook was assigned for this test run, but in the event no aircraft ditched nearby her, and so instead the first full test of the idea came when a raid was launched on Wake Island. This was attended by USS Skate, which sailed in close enough to actually be engaged by shore batteries and was then strafed by a Zero, resulting in her XO being wounded. However, she did rescue 2 pilots, and with the wounded pilots and XO aboard, she turned around and headed back for Midway. But she then received a signal that more pilots' positions had been plotted, and she reluctantly turned back. As Lockwood noted, it was a hard, but ultimately correct decision. Her XO, Maxon, died 2 days before the sub could have reached Midway even at top speed. Nothing realistically could have been done to save him. But by turning back, 4 more aviators were located and saved. The last to be picked up was Air Group Commander Mark A. Grant. Again, according to Admiral Lockwood, later in the war, his brother, Commodore Grant, was in charge of the naval base at Majuro Atoll. And shockingly, when the submarines pulled into Majuro Atoll, they found that in the view of the base Commodore, nothing was too good for them. Likewise, USS Lexington, who was the main beneficiary of Skate's lifeguarding, sent her a message that read, "Anything on Lexington is yours for the asking. If it's too big to carry away, we'll cut it up into smaller parts." Wisely, Skate didn't sour relations by asking for their ice cream machine in recompense, but such was the effect of her efforts that submarine lifeguards became a permanent feature of carrier operations from then on, wherever air operations were planned. With the Mark 14 finally coming under control and brand new submarines coming online every week, Lockwood decided to change things up a bit, and he decided to bring in wolf packs. These differed from the Kriegsmarine's efforts somewhat. Japanese convoys were typically 10 to 20% the size of Allied ones, and US subs tended to carry more and more advanced radar and sonar than most of Japan's escort fleet. Thus, instead of the double-digit numbers of subs, all regulated from ashore, Lockwood decided on small groups of submarines, which would largely be coordinated at sea from a leading sub, with Pearl Harbor only sending out intelligence updates. The other big difference was that Lockwood made sure only submarines with experienced crews were sent out on these duties, as opposed to the Kriegsmarine U-boats, which were already draining the surface fleet and frankly anywhere else they could find, of quickly trained and thus somewhat inexperienced manpower to keep up with the loss rates. The US Wolfpacks started by training on the incoming US convoys that were headed for Pearl Harbor, after of course giving due warning to avoid them being mistaken for actual attackers and then depth charged for real by the escorts. The first Wolfpack deployed operationally was a trio made up of the Cero, Shad and Greyback, under the overall command of Captain Momsen. This netted 2 ships sunk and 9 damaged, a decent haul, but not quite as well as was expected for 3 submarines who'd been sent to an area where lots of ships were known to be. Communications were improved and code messages were made simpler in response. That the Mark 18 was still causing trouble didn't help either. November was largely focused around Operation Galvanic. Submarines performed recon and survey missions ahead of the invasion, whilst most of the subfleet was in the process of being repainted, Having previously been painted black, it had been found that in actual fact the human eye is much better at spotting a black shape on a dark night than you might otherwise think, or indeed a dark shape in shallow water. So varying shades of grey were applied to the subfleet. As it turned out, this actually made them significantly harder to spot in general. Also at sea that month was another wolf pack made up of Harder, Fogey and Snook, with a third made up of Sculpin, Sea Raven and Apagon standing by off of a truck to intercept any Japanese forces that might deploy to try and interfere with Galvanic. Plunger was acting as a lifeguard for the carrier-borne airstrikes that immediately preceded the Galvanic landings, and she was due to be joined by the large Nautilus, which arrived on station a little bit later, although she ended up being badly shelled whilst trying to land a marine raiding party later that month, although as it turned out this was by the USS San Juan, which had mistaken her for an enemy patrol boat. USS Sculpin would of course be lost whilst awaiting a Japanese countermove that never came, and the Wolfpack had to be taken over by another submarine. But the Harder, Fogey and Snook pack experienced somewhat more success. November ended up netting 48 ships totaling just over 230,000 tons, plus 3 warships, and HMS Taurus, operating over in the Malacca Strait, signalled that she'd managed to stalk and sink the I-34 and could it please be added to the general list of submarine kills. Some captains were managing to get into particularly target-rich environments through a mixture of skill and sheer blind luck. The latter case could be exemplified by USS Whale. Whilst trying to get into the East China Sea, she'd been about to be run down by anti-submarine patrol vessels when a lunar eclipse, of all things, plunged the sea into darkness long enough to allow her to get through scot-free. USS Seahorse managed to get out, coming back the other way into the open ocean, after a signalman suggested that sailing out at high speed on the surface in broad daylight would be the way to go, on the general principle that no one in the Japanese Navy who was sane would ever expect a submarine to do something so unexpectedly suicidal, and so all the patrol craft would spend the day at home waiting for deployment during the night, which is when any sane submarine commander would take their sub through. Seahorse sailed through in the middle of the day and was completely ignored. USS Bowfin, which is a sub that you can actually still go and see these days, acting as a museum ship in Pearl Harbor, found itself on something of a roll, with 24 torpedoes expended on this patrol for 19 hits. Then she went on to sink 7 more small ships, including a couple of small tankers, with its deck gun. Partway through the patrol, she'd found herself sailing through a typhoon. The radar was actually being used to spot larger land masses, to keep them from running aground, when suddenly some of the islands started moving, and she found herself almost run down by a 5-ship convoy. Thinking quickly, Bowfin sank 2 tankers and a transport with a series of snap-fired salvos without being spotted. In December, consideration was given to decoy measures, since whilst success was growing, so too were losses, and with the Japanese Navy perceived as being about a year or 2 behind the Allies technologically, there was some expedience to be gained by looking at whatever the latest measure the Kriegsmarine was using that had recently been understood and somewhat overcome by the Allies, and then applying that technology to US subs in the Pacific, ejectable bubble makers being the first of such examples. Lockwood also hosted a design conference that month, which came up with a night periscope that had decent low-light capabilities, something the US subs have been crying out for a while, and this periscope also had a small radar antenna incorporated, which could be installed on almost any periscope. This would allow a degree of radar searching to be conducted, even when the submarine was completely submerged, although it would take until the end of summer 1944 for this particular night periscope and radar combination to finally be operationally deployed. More immediately useful was the arrival of a 5-inch submarine-rated deck gun, which could be used to replace the rather anemic 3-inch and 4-inch weapons, as well as a launcher for the aforementioned bubble-making decoys. The FM-type sonar, which could also be used to detect mines, a working IFF system for submarines, and a silently operating fathometer for use on enemy coastlines were also found to be ready for initial deployment at the conference. December would also see a fantastic display of seamanship, with an unforeseen tragedy appended to it when USS Sailfish found itself making slow headway in a driving storm. The waves were so heavy that the sub could only make 12 knots on the surface at full power, and when radar detected large targets moving ahead at 18 knots, she submerged with just her radar antenna poking out of the wave troughs. The resulting data was run through the torpedo data computer, and torpedoes were fired. This netted 2 hits, and the radar now showed the largest contact was circling. Another 3 torpedoes were fired, resulting in 2 further hits, and finally the rain began to die down and Sailfish finally got to see what she'd been shooting at. It turned out to be the 18,000-ton escort carrier Jul'43. 3 more shots from the stern tubes got another couple of hits, and having taken 6 torpedoes, the carrier finally rolled over and sank, albeit Sailfish found herself having to dodge a heavy cruiser which almost inadvertently ran them down, having apparently been on the other side of the carrier. The tragedy was that Jul' was actually carrying 21 survivors from the Sculpin, the submarine which had stood by and helped rescue the crew of the Sailfish back when she'd been the USS Squalus in May 1939. 20 of them would go down with the carrier, with only 1 making it to safety by leaping aboard the escorting Japanese destroyer. Gato, the lead ship of her class, had a very lucky escape on December 20th when she attacked a convoy. This attack sank a small freighter, but she was then depth-charged heavily by 2 escorts. Making her escape, she decided she was in the clear, surfaced, and made 2 nasty discoveries. Firstly, somehow the escorts were less than 2,000 yards away, which prompted a Benny Hill-style chase through rain squalls, which was made all the more perilous by the other discovery. One of the depth charges was sitting, fully armed but not detonated, on the submarine's deck. Once they were out of gun range of the escorts, the depth charge was gingerly moved to an inflatable boat, which was then cast adrift with a slow leak in it, courtesy of a diving knife, in the hope that the thing would sink in the path of the pursuing escorts and cause them some additional concerns. A week later, Gato then found herself fighting a running gun battle with a Japanese float plane, which she came off the better, thanks to her twin 20mm Oerlikons and a 50 cal machine gun. December closed out with 29 merchant ships totaling 127,000 tons and 3 warships totaling 22,000 tons having been sunk, with Silversides, another submarine that you can still visit today, albeit that one's up on the Great Lakes, having netted a decent haul each month during the last quarter, rounding out her year with 3 targets which were all sunk in a single night. 1943 thus closed out, with the US Submarine Service having claimed 308 merchant ships totaling just over 1,365,000 tons and 22 warships of varying sizes totaling just over 43,500 tons, all sunk. Considerably more ships had been damaged, and the only fly in the ointment going forward was to be hammering out the last few defects of the Mark 18, whilst hoping that BuOrd didn't get any more bright ideas for improved weapons in 1944.